Remember they had two. One was going to be the cutting edge one, and the other one was going to be the
Courtyard.
Start with an O.
Hanford Road.
We got a W, we got an O, we got an A.
Hanford Road.
We got an A. Why don't I just go to Marriott? Why
I
don't I just go to Marriott.com and look it up?
You could be Vanna White.
Or we can keep guessing.
Magazine uses for their 10 best evaluation.
There's W Hotel.
There wasn't a W, or Aloft.
Aloft, that's what
There
it
you
We
go.
would have never
Ding,
got
ding,
that
ding,
one.
ding, ding.
Got the A, but we would have never got the whole thing.
was. All right, I think we're ready to start. Is everybody's mic on? The Plymouth Township Planning Commission meeting will come to order at 7 p.m. Secretary, please call the roll.
Dennis Cebulski,
Here.
Kendra Barbrina is excused, Tim Boyd,
Here.
Bob Dorshevitz,
Here?
Gail Grieger is here, John Itzel,
Here.
and Keith Pastel.
Here. Thank you. And we have the approval of this evening's agenda, and there's one item that is being withdrawn, and that is the pre-development discussion with the Schaefer Development. It's item 8A. So with that withdrawal, is there a motion to approve as amended?
Motion to approve.
Second.
Moved by Commissioner Pastel and supported by Commissioner Itzel to approve the agenda as amended. All in favor signify by saying aye.
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 Opposed? Motion carries. And the approval of the minutes has been deferred until our next meeting on December 14th. Is there anyone here that wishes to speak to any item that is not on the agenda? Okay. And we have no public hearings, so we'll move on to application 2451, the mobile gas station, and I ask for the planner to lead off that discussion.
So this application is for new signage for the mobile gas station that is at the intersection of Sheldon and Ann Arbor Road in the Ann Arbor Corridor District. The applicant is requesting both a wall and a ground sign in replacement of the wall and ground signs that currently exist on the site. Currently, the building has a 7-Eleven panel sign on the front of the facade and an existing pole sign displaying the mobile signage and the proposed prices for the gasoline. The applicant is proposing to replace the wall sign with a freestanding letter raceway sign on top of a opaque panel background, so not a panel sign, but atop a panel background, that stands at 17 inches in height. The applicant has indicated that they are requesting 1 inch in extension of the 16 typically permitted in the ARC district due to the standardized sizing available from the national sign manufacturer. The applicant is also proposing to replace the existing non-conforming pole sign with a monument sign that is in conformance with code standards. The sign is proposed to be 25 square feet in area with 12-inch blocks on either side. If you include the 12-inch blocks on either side, the brick end caps, it technically exceeds 25 feet. However, the Planning Commission may include these pole blocks as, brick blocks as a design feature. Thereby, they do not count against the total area of the sign. The Commission has done this for other gas station signs throughout the township before. For example, at Eccles in Plymouth, I think there's a Sunoco where it was at 25 square feet, and we considered the pole blocks on either side, brick blocks on either side, to be excluded from that sign area. So that's pretty typical. In total, the sign will measure 75 inches in height, 80 inches wide, excluding the 12-inch pole blocks. It also does include the 30 inches above grade that is required for monument signs, and it currently sits inside a landscaped area. The applicant is here tonight to also speak more to the landscaping that would accompany the sign. We are recommending conditional approval, subject to the following findings: that the proposed plantings as presented by the applicant are acceptable to meet the requirements of Article 14, or that the existing landscaping as it exists today is acceptable. There's a 4-foot fence and a few burning bushes. And that the accent pillars are an integral part of the sign design and shall be excluded from the calculation of the sign area. The Planning Commission must also determine if the proposed 17-inch lettering height of the wall sign is permissible given the conditions presented.
Okay, and the applicant is here. If you step up to the podium, right, thank you. going to speak about the landscaping around the sign?
I can. The,
If you could just tell us your name for the record.
absolutely, I'm Jennifer Glover. Do you need my address as well?
Yes, okay.
Okay. I'm here representing Aver Sign Company, 359 Livernois Street in Ferndale, Michigan, 48220.
Thank you.
Upon speaking with my customer and the project manager that is in charge of this job, unfortunately, they were not able to rectify any kind of a landscape plan. The customer feels that with the fencing and then having the, I'm not sure what you call that foliage that's there around the sign currently. Is that what that's called? Thank you. They feel that that is adequate. If the board feels that they want more foliage around the sign, then prior to obtaining our permit, I can present the township with some kind of a landscape idea that would be approved by your board or the people that do the approvals.
Ms. Wolf, is it part of the ordinance for them to put landscaping?
Yes, so the ARC district specifies that there has to be landscaping around the bottom of a monument sign, but it doesn't specify exactly what that has to be. So some choose to do rose bushes, some choose to do some sort of grasses. It's really up to the applicant. At this site, the fence is about 3 to 5 feet away from the base of the sign, as are the burning bushes. So it's up to the commission to determine whether or not that is considered landscaping for the sign. If you are interested in pursuing landscaping to a further degree, you could approve it tonight on the condition that the landscaping be approved by the planning department administratively.
Yeah, even if I think, speaking for myself, something, they're trying to keep their maintenance down, you know, and I think the commission would rather see something that is low maintenance rather than something you have to keep trimmed and edged and not do it, and then it doesn't look so good. It's sort of defeating the purpose of requiring the landscaping. Something like perhaps daylilies. It would complement the daylilies that have been planted by the DDA up and down Ann Arbor Road, and that's pretty easy to maintain, in my opinion. Ms. Wolf, do you have any suggestions on other plantings, or commission? Commission have any suggestions about other plantings?
Daylilies sound like a good compromise.
I'm sorry, what did you recommend?
I was recommending daylilies for in front of the sign. They're pretty low maintenance. They would mirror what's up and down Ann Arbor Road quite a bit, so.
Yeah, they're everywhere.
Yeah.
I'm sure I could convince the customer for that.
Okay, all right,
So moving along,
yeah.
to be certain, does this mean that the post sign comes down?
Yes. The large pole sign would come down and a compliant monument sign would be put in its place.
So this is the sign that comes down, right?
Yes.
So on your mock-up mechanical, you show a red brick, but I see your materials there all show a blonde or a neutral colored palette brick. Is it really red brick, or was that just for position?
That's just for like viewing, so that you can see that we're going to be putting brick there.
What color is the brick going to be?
I don't know. The brick would be done by a different company. We're a sign company. On the drawings that I submitted, it does say that the brickwork would be done by others. I would suspect that they would match the building,
I would hope
which
so.
is what I believe is required.
It is.
Yeah.
I thought, well, Wyandotte brick is the name of the brick that's been used for, you know, the pillars that support the fencing that's along Ann Arbor Road. And I thought before we were saying that we would prefer Wyandotte brick.
I thought I read in the ordinance that the brick had to match the building.
Yes, in general, the masonry base is supposed to match the primary item on the building.
Okay.
If a building does not have a masonry facade, then the item is by default Wyandotte brick.
Oh, okay.
But if the building has an existing, say, like, you know, black obsidian facade, we're not going to ask for a
Oh,
black,
okay.
anything except for a black obsidian base, right, to make them match.
Okay, because I remember before we would say Wyandotte brick, but that might have been because building in back of the monument sign wouldn't, would be maybe some type of other, I don't know, other masonry that doesn't match or whatever.
Does the term Wyandotte brick mean a color?
Yes,
Is it a red sort of color?
kind of. I would call it more like a tan,
It sure looks once again, on that mechanical, on the structure that I don't know what the surface of that gray area is to the right of it, but I thought that was brick on the building.
I have to look at the picture of the building.
There's a picture of the building.
Yes, the building is composed of brick, either painted gray, I believe it is.
This one? Yeah, it
But
is
the-
painted brick.
You don't necessarily have to request that the monument sign also be painted gray. You could instead suggest that it comply with the surrounding brick patterns.
So that's pretty subjective.
Yeah, our requirement is that it be the same material,
Yeah.
so as long as it is brick, that's the baseline.
I believe it's a red brick. I think that's just a faded picture.
I don't-
I mean,
don't
I
think so.
used to go to that station a lot. It is brick.
Oh, it is gray.
Oops.
It's a very smooth surface brick.
It's gray to me.
Yeah, I believe it is gray.
It
I
looks good.
apologize.
It looks gray
my
to me, too.
Picture's red.
That's when it still had the 7-Eleven. Does it still have the 7-Eleven sign up now?
No, the 7-Eleven
It's gone.
in Speedway,
7-Eleven's
Speedway acquired 7-Eleven or the other way around? That's,
How about that?
that's why they left there, right?
Yeah, 7-Eleven is gone.
Yeah. But it's across the street at Speedway. The
Has ownership
Slurpees.
of that station changed hands in the last year?
That I don't know. We work for the petroleum company. We work for, let me see who this is. This one's Michigan Fuels. So we work for the jobber, the fuel company. The dealer signs a contract with what we call the jobber or the petroleum company, and then that petroleum company brands the station. And we're the authorized sign erectors for most of the petroleum companies in Detroit.
What about signage on the canopy? Is that still there, or what's happening with that?
We're not hired for the canopy work. We strictly do the price signs and building signs. The canopy work the permits would be applied for by another company. I don't know what their scope of work is for the canopy. If they're getting a mobile update, which is what we're doing, then more than likely their canopy would also have an update as well. All the petroleum brands are changing their imaging.
Would we want to wait till all that's in to approve one plan versus coming back and piecemealing it?
It's up to the applicant. The current canopy signage is in compliance, so we don't have to require that it be changed in order to permit other signage. And if the applicant wishes to do it in two separate applications, they may.
Could you bring up the area of Ann Arbor Road where the DFCU credit union is? I think
let's
it's
see.
on Lily,
Yeah.
maybe?
wrong side of the street again.
On the same side as the mobile station.
Stay in the white lines.
Get out of this mode. I know. Sheldon, Ann Arbor.
Right on the corner, there's a monument sign. Can you zoom in so we can see that monument sign? Right where your arrow, yeah, you'll have to come in, you have to go further east to see it, because it's like,
Oh, look at that.
Oh, we just went back in time.
There it is.
I have not been drinking to find what it looks
now
like.
see that sign? I don't know if that matches that building.
Does that brick on the base match the building, Bob?
Is that what
Brick on
Wyandotte brick is, Dennis?
It's, yes, where the little pillars are, you know, with the
Right.
decorative balls on the top, that's Wyandotte.
Building
The
looks red.
finials.
Yeah, it does.
Yeah.
The building looks more red.
Mm-hmm.
Whoops. Sorry, what did I just do here? Lost my place. Here we go. Definitely redder. But what they did, they put plantings in front of the fence.
Right,
So we're asking them to do the same thing.
right, it's a corner, so I think part of it is the sight lines, you know, for traffic.
Yeah,
But I do remember that sign didn't match the building. And that was all new, that was a new building. Because you saw earlier when you went back in time, it was the hardware store.
it blew my mind.
It doesn't look bad, though, that it
I
doesn't
think the
match.
sign base
Matches the
matching the
fence.
pillars is good.
Yeah. I do too.
Well, it's likely that the pillars will last longer than the building. You know, it'll be changed.
Right.
So the question is whether we want to try to match the building per se, or have a neutral Wyandotte type.
That matches the streetscape that will
Yes.
probably be there for some years.
Yeah, I think that'll preclude that, so. uh,
Well, that's something to think about. I'm looking at these others. And then, I just want to call the commission's attention to page 4, item 3, about the height of the letters. Does anyone have an issue with that? It's 1 inch.
No,
I don't.
Okay. I just want to make sure we.
On the setback, Dennis, or?
No, the letters
Height.
are 17 inches, and it's 16, but that's what's the supplier. Because that should be included in the motion, that we approve the extra inch. And then the motion should also include about the landscaping that'll be approved administratively when we get it. And the brick base, we're back to the brick base.
I have one more question. It talks about on the notes and conditions on the memorandum, page 1. It says number 2, the accent pillar is an integral part of the sign design and shall be excluded from the calculation of the sign area. Is that reference there because that's contrary to what ordinance says?
Yes, so the ordinance says that the sign area shall be calculated using everything above 30 inches above grade. So the 30 inches and below is excluded. If you were to follow the letter of the ordinance, it says essentially that you would be including those pillars as the area. However, for gasoline monument signs specifically, the Planning Commission has the authority to basically exclude those pillars from the calculation of the sign area 30 inches above grade. So that would be included in the motion as well, to consider those an integral part of the site design, if the commission chooses to do so.
So are we ready for a motion? More discussion about the sign?
Okay, I'll go ahead with it. For PC 2451, motion to approve with to be decided on the administrative action on the color of the brick base, either to match the building or to be comparable to the Wyandotte brick. Understanding the pole sign will be removed and the 17-inch letters approved, and we would exclude from the calculation the 12-inch pillars on either side.
And the landscape.
And the landscaping would be administrative as well as the and recommended are daylilies.
Okay, is there support for that?
I support.
Okay. Moved by Commissioner Postel and supported by Commissioner Itzel to approve application 2451, Mobile Gas Station, subject to said conditions. All in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries.
Thank you for your
Thank you.
time, everybody.
Okay.
Thank you.
Next is application 2455, the Raw Palace sign. And Ms. Wolf, your report.
Thank you. The Planning Department is recommending approval of this sign as presented. However, the Planning Commission must still determine whether the increased projection from the building wall due to the sign's location on a corner is acceptable. Given the unique position of the tenant on an interior corner of the shopping center, and to allow the business owner the same signage opportunity as other tenants in the plaza, it is recommended that the Planning Commission allow for this increased projection from the front wall. This is the application that you all saw before you last month. Per your recommendation, the second line has been removed from the projecting sign, and it now only reads Raj Palace. We should also note that the total signage area is 13.33 square feet.
Okay. Is the applicant here for this?
Good evening. This is a request. My
If
name
you could
is
just
Michael
give,
Zacks.
if you could just give us your name and address for the record.
Michael Zacks. I'm the general manager for Nationwide Signs, 7629 Embassy Drive, Canton, Michigan, 48197. Zacks is the spelling of the last name. And what you have before you is a request to install a conforming sign. The size of the letters is 16 inches. The entire sign is 13 square feet. It sits on an aluminum raceway. Unfortunately, this particular location sits in the back of the plaza. It sits in a corner, so the hardship there is there's not sufficient room on either side to mount the sign. The previous tenants have been allowed by virtue of the planning commission to mount it so it spans across the two different facades and allow it to be visibly more viewed.
Okay, that's it?
I think that's it.
Okay. Any concerns about this? This is, as he had said, the Shimmy Shack Commission at that time approved that projection because of the uniqueness of the location of the business and where it sits on that corner.
I'm good with it.
So am I.
Okay, just whoever makes the motion, just be sure to include that we've approved this in the past for previous tenants. So we're ready for a motion.
I'll go ahead and, as it relates to PC 2455, the Raj Palace, to approve as presented, and to make sure that the council or the commission gives the approval on a diagonal type installation on a corner, and that it is a continuation of what was approved in the site prior.
Second.
Okay. Moved by Commissioner Itzel and supported by Commissioner Boyd to approve application 2455. All in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries.
Thank you.
Sure.
Thank you.
Next is application 2456, Vanessa Flowers, and your report.
Thank you. The Vanessa's Flower Building is an existing building located in a multi-tenant site at 545 Ann Arbor Road. Some of you have probably seen their existing sign. It's white, and it does not have their logo. And today, the applicant is proposing to replace that sign with a white, internally illuminated sign with individual letters that has a flat blue background. So what you're seeing before you is the measurement of the background rather than the individual letter height, and the applicant has sent us updated information to indicate that the top line reading Vanessa's, the letters excluding the flat blue background that would go behind the individual letters, the letters measure 14 inches and 16 inches. So keep in mind that depending on whether or not you include that backer panel, changes the total letter height. As such, it is recommended that the Planning Commission grant approval of the proposed internally illuminated wall sign that is 41.42 square feet in size, as it complies with the zoning ordinance standard, providing that the Planning Commission finds the letter heights of 19 inches and 22.24 inches and the logo height of 23 inches acceptable. It's important to note that this replacement sign now includes the established company logo and is smaller in size than the maximum allowed permitted by the zoning ordinance. The sign must also correctly note the proposed square footage of 41.42 square feet. And that has been corrected on this updated application. Oh, sorry, 41.42 has not been corrected. It incorrectly says 41.2 square feet. So just note that that's a small deviation.
And the applicant is here. If you step forward.
Hi, my name is Victor West, and I'm the owner of Vanessa's Flowers at 545 Ann Arbor Road.
Okay.
And basically what we're doing is, the sign we currently have is just block letters, and we're kind of going, would you say more contemporary? It's updated. It will match the signs that have been put up better than just the black letters. With the Sunny J's, the MJ's, Salon, the Page Ryan, thank you. Hair salon, it'll give it a more uniform look, so.
Okay.
Didn't the facade color change recently?
It did, and that's one of the reasons we're doing the backing on it is because during the day it wouldn't be visible, because we wanted to go to a white more readable, so the backing just during the day you can see it, at night you'll see just the white.
Is the new color like a medium to charcoal gray, the fascia?
My part of the building is actually a white, so that's one of the reasons we decided to go with the backing. It's a lot prettier. And previously, we were part of a franchise and there was a logo up there, but there hasn't been for a while. And the sign is deteriorated and is not attractive during the day right now.
So it is a franchise or it's not a?
No. I was originally a part of a franchise.
Oh,
So,
So the logo is a unique logo then?
yeah, it's the Vanessa's Flowers logo.
And how long has that been your logo?
30 years
Oh, okay.
next year. So,
The icon in the middle of your logo, a lady smelling flowers, is that what it's
it's
supposed to
a
be?
picture of my daughter when she was 16. She's now 43. 44, I'm sorry.
so she's your Wendy, huh?
Yeah, she's my one, yeah.
So does she get royalties off of this logo?
No, they're extremely successful, so I don't think she needs it.
Oh, okay. Any comments from the commission on item 6 on page 2? On the determination that we need to do?
Bob, can you pull up the other businesses with their current signs?
I don't, they're all
These
within
are-
the
Those are
past.
all
These are
outdated.
pretty,
Six.
yeah, these are out of.
There was the MJ Salon, which has the large letters. There's the Sunny J's.
But I was by there today, I just,
Yeah,
yeah, those are all outdated, aren't
But
they?
the other place, this still has the Anytime Fitness
Yeah.
and,
Well, that's Sunny J's now,
yeah.
their sign is up.
Oh, is it off?
yeah, that sign's been up a little bit longer. The Sunny J's Pages just went up.
This is from November
Last week.
2020.
Yeah, that's,
Did the landlord change I know they changed the color, but did they change the
The
fascia
canopies and
material as well?
Yeah, I'm sorry?
Did they change the fascia material as well?
No. What happened was, it was a T111, which is no longer manufactured, so they had to tear down that and put up, it's just basically a wood that's been painted underneath. And where I'm at is actually a brick that was painted white. And the canopies have been changed to black. It'll look much nicer.
I think it's a nice looking sign.
Yeah.
And if you have been by there, it really goes well with the other existing signs.
Particularly like the blue surrounding on there, that's,
That's the Reflex Blue is our company color. So everything was originally Reflex Blue, and I'm trying to stick with that. A little bit darker.
I don't
It's
have
more of
I don't have a problem with it.
more towards a navy. Back in the day, Reflex Blue was like one of the print colors that was common, so we wanted Reflex Blue.
How much of a variance is it in size over what's in the ordinance?
If you're excluding the blue background and counting the letters to be the internally illuminated portion, the bottom row exceeds 16 inches by 2.2 inches. So the top row would measure 14.9 inches letter height, the bottom row measures 18.2 inches of letter height.
Yeah, and my portion of the building is also set back about 6 to 8 feet deeper than the rest of the building. It goes in and then it kind of goes in and then comes back out. And then we're like the Paige Ryan Salon is actually probably 9 to 10 feet further out than ours is.
Paige Ryan's been there for just a few months now, right?
Literally, yeah, literally. Her sign went up a week and a half ago, I believe.
So they could have 2 rows of 16 or 2 rows that total 32 is the other option.
Yes.
Yeah. So it's still the same overall size.
Yeah, the signage area would not change.
Yeah, that was my point.
However, keep in mind that if both lines were the same size in height, then they would no longer have the same proportions for the letters. So it would have to be like the sign is today, where flowers is kind of stretched out in order for them to have that same distance of them.
Right, right. It would be distorted.
Yeah, it would be distorted.
Well, I think the point that you made, that you're set back a little bit, also helps
Yeah,
make the
and-
case to have slightly larger letters, and it's illuminated differently.
Yeah,
So
I think our strip mall is probably, other than where you were just talking about, where the CVS is at, I think we're set back the furthest from pretty much most of the buildings on Ann Arbor Road.
Well, are we ready for a motion? Who wants to make that motion?
Okay. You want to do it?
You gonna do it, Bob?
Sure, I'd be happy to. Mr. Chairman, I move to approve application number 2456, Vanessa's Flowers, sign review number 2. In the context that we're approving the proposed internally illuminated sign, and the Planning Commission has also found that the letter heights of 19 inches and 22.424 inches respectively are acceptable.
I'll second.
Okay, moved by Commissioner Dorchevitz and supported by Commissioner Grieger to approve application 2456, based on the findings of fact for the lettering height. All in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries.
All right, thank you very much.
Okay, good
All
luck.
right, take care.
All right, now we're ready to move on to item 8B, the parking regulations memo that we've gotten. So I'll turn to Ms. Wolf to kind of lead us on this discussion.
All right. I'm going to give everyone a second to get the right paper out because I was just sifting through them. So in previous months, we had discussed the update to the parking zoning ordinance and have listened to commissioner comments and begun the actual text update. What you see before you today is a partial update of the parking minimums table. So staff has reviewed the Institute for Traffic Engineers Parking Generation Manual. The ITE has been a leader in parking generation data for more than 3 decades and is used by most municipalities to calculate their parking minimums. And we should note that ITE collects parking data from across the entire country by sending out engineers into the field to count the number of cars at a given location over the course of 1 week for a 24-hour period. So due to this, there is not an observation for every type of land use under the sun. The ITE is a limited manual. It has several hundred land use classifications, but not all of them. So for ones that did not have an appropriate match in the ITE manual, those have been left with a note that says no such category, benchmarking required. For those, staff will review the codes of neighboring communities to Plymouth Township, such as Canton, Northville, Livonia, Superior Township, to find the most appropriate benchmarking parking minimum to use in the township. To give a brief overview, the ITE groups their data by land use code. So a land use code 220 might be, like I said, land use code 220 is low-rise multifamily dwellings. And these codes really don't mean anything outside of the context of the ITE manual. I just included them so if someone else who owns the manual wants to check, that they can refer to the code that is included herein and check it on their own. So after ITE aggregates their studies by land use code, they then sort them into the different times of day. Typically that's weekday daytime, weekday nighttime, weekend morning, and weekend evening. Although for some specific amenities like stadiums or bars, they will also have the peak times for those businesses included. For each of those peak times, ITE analyzes the data and provides the average 85th percentile and 33rd percentile parking amounts. So the average is the average number of cars they see in that period of time across all of their different observations at different sites. The 85th percentile is basically the high-end estimate, and the 33rd percentile is the low-end estimate. And that's to capture whether or not the data has a lot on the low end or a lot on the high end, right? So you give all three. You can also use this information to determine if the data is reliable enough to use. So if you have a very high 85th percentile, it might indicate that you have some outliers that are really high, and conversely the same for a very low 33rd percentile. And you can determine which of those three measurements, average, 85th, or 33rd, is the most appropriate. So to do what you have before you today, this big table, which I know is very fun to look at, the township used the land use code that was most appropriate for each one that we already had in our parking table, and also the most appropriate time of day. So for example, the weekend nighttime time frame was used for residential uses, while the weekend morning time frame was used for churches. Basically, whatever the time frame is that has the highest peak is the one that was selected for this review. Additionally, there were some for which there were few to no observations. So some of these, they sent out engineers to 2 bowling alleys or something like that, whereas we look for at least data that has 10 or more individual sites that have been observed, so that the data is more reliable. Because if you only have 2 points, it's not really a reliable trend. So we only use those that were actually reliable for this purpose. So, I know it's a lot. What questions do you have?
Well, first of all, I think this is a really good prologue, and I'm not sure how you're going to use it in the future, maybe to educate the Board of Trustees, if we move forward with this project. The one thing that, I have one question and then one suggestion. So I went to the website for this group, and I found a couple of there were some journal articles and some other information that I thought was very useful, and that is they're making the case that these large parking lots are going away, and a lot of it is environmental and the costs and that. And I think, depending on how you're going to use this, and I'm not sure, but if you're going to move forward with it, I thought that was useful. Like, why are we doing this? Mm-hmm. What was the justification to take this on? So I think that's great. Then you took the average, but would the median been a better measure?
They do not provide the median. They provide only the average, 85th, and 83rd.
I wonder about
and
that.
For each one, they gave the standard deviation, which basically shows you how widely the data is spread. A lower standard deviation means more reliable data, and a wider one means less reliable data. So if the standard deviation was very low, I took the average. If this data was pretty wide, I looked at the graph, determined where the data was skewed, and chose either the 85th or the 33rd.
So what do you see, what are you expecting from us today, just to look at that, offer suggestions, and then what are the next steps? So we can kind of put this in contextual.
So one thing I would love today is for the commission's input on categories that may be missing from this table. So there's a few I suggested that we add that are marked in red. For example, let me find them.
Right at the beginning.
Right at the beginning, a few residential categories.
So did I read this right? It says there's no category for attached or detached one-family dwellings?
We previously grouped all 4 of those categories together.
Oh.
But in general, we find that apartments have different parking requirements than single-family homes. So most communities separate them, and that would be bringing us, up to par with our neighbors in how we treat single-family homes. But there's a few others that also were not previously included. For example, we don't have pharmacies, we don't have liquor stores, we don't have home improvement, convenience, gas stores, things like that. So those are ones in the ITE manual that I specifically thought we should include. But if there's ones outside the ITE manual that you see around the township and you say, hey, we should have a specific category for that, we can benchmark those elsewhere.
We never had supermarkets before?
We did not.
So are the LUCs standard from this manual?
They're standard across all of the ITE manuals.
Yeah, but so the township just didn't adopt certain ones? Is that what it was?
Yes. And keep in mind, our parking ordinance is several decades old.
Yeah.
And as ITE issues a new manual every year, they will add more land use codes.
So when it was adopted, whoever drove that activity at that time just chose not to include grocery stores to that question.
Maybe there was only one.
I think this group has been in existence for about 30 years. Mm-hmm. So maybe they were, there was a learning curve as they started that. And, when did we approve our you know.
That's an interesting methodology. They go around and count cars and say, well, this kind of business needs has this much traffic. Strange, but.
And
Well,
right
you know,
now,
car suppliers and car manufacturers will walk around parking lots and look inside people's cars to see how are they using that space, and then they design whatever they see that might be useful to their customers.
and
Everyone's
today,
watching us.
They don't look in my car.
today
Hope they
ITE
don't
is
look in my
on,
trunk.
ITE is now on the 5th generation of their parking manual. So for context, when we adopted it, they would have been on the 1st generation of their parking manual.
Well, I don't know if these are important comments, you know, as I went through the grid here, but when I got to churches, and we were kind of struggling with this a little bit, you know, it goes by pews and every, you know, seats, but then, you know, we had a mosque, who knows if we're not going to have more mosques, you know, so you know, you have to look at prayer rugs is usually how they do it. I don't know how you would adapt to those religious organizations that typically don't have pews, so I don't know,
That's great. I'll make a note of that.
you know, what to do there. And then you know, the thing that surprised me a little bit going through it, as I went through it, there were like, well, so I had a question, there's no page numbers on here, but I looked at the one that says conference centers, exhibit halls, and similar facilities. So would that include places like St. John's? Because there's a multi-purpose there. You have the, you know, wedding receptions, it could be an exhibit hall, you know, it could be a conference center. So how would we do that? How would we determine what's an appropriate standard?
When there's multiple uses like St. John's, it's typically under a PUD, which is usually necessary to intermingle those uses on a site. And PUDs are flexible, right? These parking minimums don't necessarily apply to them. We just use these as baselines to inform our understanding of how much parking is in demand. But if someone were to build a standalone conference center, say somewhere in the industrial district or something, and it was by right permitted, then they would be subject to these standards.
I think in general, on the, where no such category exists and requires benchmarking, I think you're going to get in trouble with not looking at unique situations, the specific things. For example, and in fact, maybe the only one might be a mobile home park, where you just have two per dwelling unit. But in most cases, private halls, lodges, private clubs, it requires, you have to look at the context of where that is and where it is. There's a good reason for inadequate data for golf driving ranges. You know, I mean, it just doesn't make sense to try and change what we have in the ordinances for so many, I think, per hole and things. It leads you into a trap that gets weird. You know, it's not unique. They are unique situations. And for instance, a conference center, I wouldn't, you have to look at the purpose of it, how it's used, how to draw an average across this is just leading you into a messy situation that I wouldn't change anything on those categories that are not defined.
But how do you do that without, I mean, this has some science to it. whether it's valid.
Averages. It's talking about averages
It
and
is.
not the specific situation and,
But how do you do that? I'm interested in your point of view.
well, first off, if a developer wants to put in some facility and it's not a shared facility, that takes special attention because if he doesn't provide the parking, he's got a problem on there. And it's not that it's a strip mall where you get a shared parking through different things. I just think getting too specific, you're asking for more trouble than you're going to expect.
So are you saying it should be less specific than what the township currently has?
I'm not suggesting changing the township's items unless there's a specific reason for that. You certainly don't have to be concerned about golf driving ranges and miniature golf and things. We don't have any. And if you're talking about space requirements, if they don't have enough parking for the required number or the anticipation of how big the unit is, it just is going to lead you into a real messy situation as opposed to leaving it where it is and changing some specific category that you figure might be a problem.
But do you think that it could get messy the other way because it becomes a little bit more arbitrary? There's no standard being applied, so how do you treat, I mean, with the point of view that you're making, and I think you're making a really good point, how do you apply that and apply it in a way that it's not, that it's fair to everybody?
Having a reference, and obviously for post office, you have no say whatsoever. But museums, that entails such a broad base. And when you take an average, that average doesn't really have any credibility to the square footage. I mean, you could have a museum that is all small things, and yeah, maybe the building they're in covers greater square footage than they need. And I don't think to change any of the standards, you need a good reason to do it and not an average over the whole country.
Well, the ones that would say require benchmarking just means that I, as the staff, have not yet had the time to research our neighboring communities. So
if they give you an average, you're going to get all sorts of squirrely results. It's one thing to reference it, but not to change our standards, or you're just going to be in trouble. And then you say, well, that's ridiculous for that situation, but that's the standard, you know. And an average, I think the good thing was the median, having a real understanding of how it spreads out. Averages can be totally misleading.
So I guess that's what I was trying to describe earlier. Although they don't provide a median, they provide an actual display graph of every single land use code that shows how the data is spread. So when creating these, I only use those which have a reliable distribution of points on that graph. If something is clearly unreliable, very skewed, very spread apart, it was not included in this report.
I think over-regulating is a bigger problem than leaving it to individual situations.
So are you saying we shouldn't have minimum parking at all?
Hear you.
Are you saying we should not have minimum parking regulations at all?
No, we have parking requirements. If we come up with a situation where it's obviously something to change, that makes sense. But to adopt a whole bunch of things where because of the standards in some other part of the country for a hospital, which is a very broad term, require a certain number of parking places. It's one thing to reference it, but not to change this standard unless we have a problem with it.
Well, the commission directed me last time to change these standards because we do have a problem with it. There's an
Well,
excess of
then, the
parking.
ones that we have a problem with,
We have a problem with all the parking. There's too much parking overall in the township. It creates an infrastructure cost. It creates stormwater runoff. It, like I said, pushes out businesses that would otherwise locate in the township. So the initial memo I presented was a justification for this exact thing that is presented before you today, a correction of the minimum parking standards to be in line with both our neighboring communities and the national standards for minimum parking to correct those negative externalities. That's why we're doing this here today.
I hear you, but I don't agree with it.
That's okay.
So what's the process here? Would a recommendation be made to the Board of Trustees based on what the Planning Commission comes up with your?
Yes, not just this today. You will receive
Right.
a full ordinance draft text that you would be then
Right.
recommending. This is just the preliminary table. The parking ordinance is much longer than this. It includes
Right,
narrative
right.
standards, yeah.
Right, but I'm just asking what the steps are.
Like any other ordinance amendment, it would come before you for a public hearing, then it would proceed to the Board of Trustees for actual adoption or denial.
So will this document, that we're looking at today, will this be provided to the Board of Trustees?
Yes, it would be provided in complete form though. So it would be within the context of the rest of the ordinance, and then we'd have one that is out like this showing the old and the new.
Oh, okay, so it's going to be incorporated in a more detailed way.
Yeah, a more official manner.
Right.
And all of these ones that are blue would be filled in with appropriate comparisons from our neighboring communities.
So it wouldn't be final, or it wouldn't come back before us until you had the benchmarks?
And also the rest of the ordinance.
Right. But this particular piece would have, where you said where it's in blue, you would actually have data in there then?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, no category would be without data.
Okay.
And I will point, some of these, we, through the research have shown that the township's current standards are absolutely appropriate. So it would only be a recommendation to modify the ones that are substantially different.
And what were the neighboring communities that you were going to benchmark?
Particularly Canton and Livonia have more comparable standards than Northville and Superior Township, but we would be looking at those with similar populations and similar land use patterns. So, the city of Plymouth would not be a good benchmark for us, for example.
I have a couple comments. Bob, I don't know if you can scroll 8 pages ahead. The particular chart I want to talk about, the far left corner, it says open air business.
Sorry, Tim, what are you looking for?
Open air business.
Go forward 8 pages until you see the one that says open air business at the top left.
For recreational vehicles or for landscaping materials?
Yeah, it says landscaping, lumber, and accessory building materials, et cetera. But that's not the one I want to talk about. The one I want to talk about is the next line down, which is shopping centers. Okay, now there you go. So the way I read this, our present standard here is half a space per 100 square feet of usable floor area in shopping centers. The proposal here is to half that, so a quarter per 100 square foot of usable floor area. Board, I have to tell you, having spent my 35 years in the auto industry and having watched trends and so forth, we have to be careful on this. I'll give you one example. About 10, 15 years ago, there was a large view in the auto industry that millennials were not going to be buying cars. And if they did, that they would be very small cars. Well, what's actually happened is that in the industry, the biggest single customers for SUVs today, like Ford Explorers, are millennials. And they're buying them in much larger quantities than we had expected. So my point simply is that when we look at this, we need to be looking at not just what the current thought process is in the political world. We have to look a little longer term, particularly for something like a shopping center, where if you don't have adequate parking and you've built your shopping center and you're landlocked, then you're really in a difficult situation. My point here would be, and I'm thinking of that Riverbank Square shopping center where we were just looking at the two things tonight. I used to go to the gym that was there. It was,
Anytime?
yeah, and even at 7 or 8 o'clock in the morning, half that lot was full. And I'm just wondering if that's an example. I'm presuming that met this criteria of 0.5 per 100 square feet. I really wonder if we took that lot and halved it. I think there's times that parking lot might have been too small. So my proposal on this one would be to go halfway, so we would make it 0.375 parking spaces per 100 square feet, recognizing that there probably are shopping centers where there is space that's not being used with the issues that Nanny has raised. But we have to be careful here because we're making a long-term decision, and I think having the parking space in shopping centers is just, it's too radical a move without long-term perspective or long-term proof to suggest it's the right thing to do. And on that basis, I would then say that either we as a planning commission or we need to appoint somebody to really go through all of these recommendations and make sure they meet what I would call a test of reasonableness. So it's taking the data points from this national survey, which is an excellent perspective, but then also applying our common sense or what we've experienced ourselves as members of Plymouth Township community and saying, does that meet the test of reasonableness, or do we need something that's a bit more in the middle between the two of them? So those are my comments.
Well, kind of coupled with that with shopping centers, what I'm questioning, when I was reading here about like urgent care centers, you have that code in here. So what happens, and I'm thinking of the CVS one, the Essel Squares, so now we got an urgent care place there. I mean, we don't know what businesses will ever go in there. It's changed a lot. There was a couple of restaurants in there at one time. So how do we accommodate for that?
If a business cannot meet the minimum parking requirements, they are not permitted on that site. So that's the issue we were facing today with some businesses that want to occupy existing buildings, is that they couldn't fit within the parking requirements.
So does that mean, for example, when the urgent care place moved in, is someone from the township going to, it's a deal between a landlord and the owner, the new business. They'll come in probably for a sign because, they have to advertise. So somebody's going to tell them you can't lease out that space because you need more parking than what could be provided.
Yes, so they have to file both a change of ownership and a change of use with the assessing department, because that's required every time a new use comes in, and changes in permitted uses are reviewed by both the building department and the planning department. So when something like that comes in, we are there to.
So the landlord files that every time they get a new tenant in a building?
Typically, yes.
Okay.
And if they don't, then we come out and tell them to.
But that's after the deal's been signed, sealed, and delivered, after they have a lease in place. They're not doing that prospectively.
Usually they do call us ahead of time, actually.
Say, is it okay if this business moves in here?
Yeah,
Really?
because they want to know
On a
both.
shared parking lot, how do you calculate that?
You calculate the minimums for the businesses that do exist, and then you add in the minimum for the proposed business and make sure the total accounts for it.
I have a few comments. a few comments, statements, and questions. I don't see the category of funeral home. Is that in here?
Good catch. We should include that. That is not in here.
I don't know, I thought I saw it.
So when we come to multi-dwelling housing units, do we include garage spaces?
Here it is, John.
So garage spaces could be
funeral
included.
home.
Funeral home, we do have funeral
Mortuaries
homes.
and funeral homes, it's in
Oh,
there.
It's
there it
in
is.
there.
Never mind. Looks like I did include it.
Okay, moving along. Multifamily, many multifamilies have garage spaces. So are garage spaces calculated as part of a formula or
Yep.
not?
Yep, anything that is off the street.
Right, but even though garage spaces have limited access.
As long as they have room for 2 vehicles per dwelling unit off the street, that's what counts.
All right, I think one issue that I don't see in here, but I know it caused a lot of discussion when we spoke about this a month ago, is the size of parking spaces. It seems like some are minimal and some are really generous. And as Tim was saying, vehicles are getting bigger, where population's getting older, more people are, in need of, whether it be wheelchairs or whether it be ADA considerations. And of course, I know there's ADA spots, but there's kind of a gray area between people that don't have an ADA sticker and that need room to get out. So I think that I'm sure there's standards for sizes of parking, but I sure like pulling into lots that have the double lines and they don't give you a bit more space, and I hope we're considering that. Is that anywhere in this this memorandum?
We do not have double lines in the ordinance today, but we can make
I'm
accommodations.
not saying
for
we
that.
should, I'm just saying the size is really important.
I agree with that, and I did look at that to see what was said, in the professional area about the size of parking spots, and it seems like it varies on how that lot is striped. So, you go into a parking lot, I think most of them are like this now, you go at a 90-degree angle to it. Some are at 45, and of course there's parallel. So it depends on how the parking lot is striped.
Yes, that is true. The angle of the parking changes how big each individual space is. So typically, we see a width between 9 and 10 feet and a depth between 18 and 20 feet for a standard 90-degree entry parking space in modern America.
So I understand the item of shopping center. Now, we have a shopping center, technically, it's on 5 Mile between Beck and Sheldon, but it's primarily occupied by restaurants. So even though, that seems, and that's the one parking lot that comes to mind that's problematic in the sense that there's often not enough parking in that parking lot. So I think it's kind of a sub-argument of what, or topic of what we're talking about now. It is a bunch of restaurants, essentially doing business as a shopping center, and that's concerning.
Is that where the Red Olive is, that one?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I hear a lot about that. So in front of this commission, on a few occasions over the years, I've heard people say, we don't need to be that focused on businesses exceeding the number, because there'll be an ebb and flow of, if people can't park there, the business is penalized. And I would say, no, that's not always true. If there's not enough parking, oftentimes people leave their vehicles, whether it be a side of streets or other parking. So there is a consequence for not having enough parking beyond just the business owner having to, shoulder it.
So I think something to also consider before the commission is perhaps whether or not the definition of a shopping center is outdated in itself. Like you said, we could have a different description where maybe this is the minimum parking for a speculative shopping center, and they have to have banked parking if they require more. So 0.25 at a baseline, and then another 0.2 or 0.1 for banked parking or something like that. Whereas for a shopping center that has known tenants, the parking could be calculated based off the actual use that those tenants would be through a shared parking agreement. Something like that, because this is an old ordinance, so sometimes these categories are not necessarily the most ideal for what we have today. So I think it's a great point that you guys bring up with the shopping center, this arrangement.
And that was my
definition.
last topic, was we spoke last time about shared parking. And I just don't see a world where that works in the sense of, as we talked about, when they open up, they have, attendants that are, non-restaurant, non-gym, et cetera. Year number 2 or 3, they have a restaurant and a gym and another restaurant, and all of a sudden you go, now we have a real problem because the shared parking is quite different than when it was approved on in the beginning. So you wondered if there is a standard there that's say, a worst case scenario, best case scenario, depending on which side you're on. But I would have great concerns about shared parking, knowing that tenants often change.
Yeah, I think I'll create a draft of what shared parking language typically looks like to bring before you guys the next time we discuss this. I think that'll help us with our discussion about like what is shared parking, what sites would qualify for shared parking, those sorts of things. Because right now it's a little ambiguous, I didn't provide you with the language and that's on me.
I would recommend you go to the website for the city of Scottsdale.
Okay.
And there is a section of their ordinance that deals with shared parking. So I'll leave it to you as the professional to read it and interpret it. But what they do, and we talked about credits, remember about having, credits if you put charging stations in and bikes and all that kind of stuff. Well, they have shared parking if a business only operates from like 8 o'clock to 5 o'clock. And then there's an adjacent business that their busy time is more in the evening. I'm thinking like a restaurant or a tavern or something, that they can share that parking with the other business that is closed for the day.
Yes, that is what shared parking is. I think there's some confusion about the definition. What you just described is exactly what a shared parking agreement would be, only between businesses that have opposite hours.
Yeah, so look at that. I was intrigued with that
shift
provision.
So how would you happen to know that? I'm not
Because
curious.
I like Scottsdale because I think it's a very well-planned city. They have very few curb cuts, that Scottsdale Road, that sort of is this main spine. That traffic moves really nice. The lights are timed properly.
Yeah.
I had a discussion with Sally Hodges. I don't know if you know Sally Hodges, and she agreed with me. She says that's because they started out when they were, tiny, not built up like it is today. And they developed a good plan, and they stuck to it. And she says the planners will be proud to tell you that.
Like they played the video game in advance.
Yeah.
Once again, I think that's great, the shared parking concept of the hours. But then again, after, what year, whether it be, 2, 3, 5, 10, when the use changes, it becomes a lot more problematic.
It would be the same as current parking. What if you're in a non-shared lot, say you're a dental office and you close and someone wants to open a tire shop, if you can't meet the current parking standards, you're not permitted in that building. So the same thing, if you had a shared parking lot that was under a shared parking agreement between you and your neighboring tenant of opposite times, your neighboring tenant closes and someone else new moves in, if they cannot meet the parking needs and they have the same time as you with the lot provided, they would have to provide additional spaces.
So are you proposing that you're held to the same standard of the space you're in, or who's in prior, meaning if it was a flower shop, you would have to, I don't understand with these sliding scales all the time of new businesses, how you could ever enforce such a thing.
Sure, so most of the time when businesses share a parking lot or are part of say a strip mall, the parking that they have today exceeds the total aggregate of all the businesses, right, when you add them up. Shared parking is typically used for, I would say, buildings that say have commercial on the bottom and residential on the top. A pretty reliable place where the mix is going to endure longer than the parking exists, right? Whereas if you had a shared parking between two strip mall tenants, if someone left, they would be held to the standards of, the regular parking minimums for that tenant.
Right, but doesn't that kind of get back to what you said a few minutes ago about we have some current parking ordinance that are so restrictive, we're losing business, so even if we would do that arrangement, and you could still lose businesses because.
Yeah, there's always a chance that someone will want to move on to a site that cannot meet the requirements for their business. The only way to truly ensure that no business will ever be pushed out is to eliminate parking minimums, but that's not where we are today in Plymouth Township.
I guess in closing, my fear is that we come up with a plan that essentially trades in one set of problems for a different set of problems, so I would
But I think
caution against that.
you bring up a good point, which is that maybe shared parking is only appropriate for buildings that share the uses within one structure, right? So if a building has commercial on the bottom, residential on the top, it's known that for the perpetual future, those two uses will be at different times of day. So maybe the, shared parking is strictly restricted to buildings that have those uses in the same structure, something like that.
What are the situations in which you have too much parking in our ordinances?
I mean, I can let the commission.
You presented the argument for it was bad for the environment and whatever, too much and unnecessary. Because frankly, a developer, the last thing he wants to do is put in way too much parking for what they need. And they have a pretty good handle on what they're going to need. They can somehow squeeze a situation and have too little, but too much is, unless it's an existing lot that just turns out to be way too much, like maybe Kmart, that type of thing. But because you stripe, I know from experience, if you overstripe, you create all sorts of requirements for your disability spaces. And you have to have X number of disability spaces based on the striping you do. So they don't want to overdo the parking lot, but they know their business. And, I think you got to be very careful about reducing the amount of parking that's necessary, because a lot of times you're going to have a certain amount of space and a new tenant is going to move in. I'm thinking of our township, and it is what it is. They're not going to start planting trees in the parking lot, but they will avoid striping.
So the township currently requires about 30% more parking than commercial businesses want.
Where?
Throughout the entire township.
No,
I think through this whole chart, because the proposal is to reduce, not expand the minimum parking.
Right. And
That's this whole chart, almost every one reduces the minimum.
Yeah,
So we're trying to, so the developer would always be free to go beyond that minimum, but that's the minimum standard.
but in reality, he's going to have a certain amount of space.
Absolutely.
And he either decides that fits his.
But the point is, I think the point is that I'm going to build a building, and the minimum requirement today is that I have 20 spaces. I can put in 30 if I want. Nobody's going to stop me from doing that.
He has the space.
Right. But what this proposal is saying, instead of the minimum being 20, the reality is that the minimum should be 15, because the data demonstrates that 15 is a more precise minimum number, so you don't have too much parking. I mean, I'm sorry, I don't mean to be
Where
explaining
do
the
we
obvious,
have
but-
too much parking?
I could tell you right now, would be the Henry Ford facility. Because that facility exceeded what was required, but that's what they wanted because they had experience to kind of support your point, I guess, at their other facilities where they're offering similar services to what they're doing here. And they said the parking lot's always full. We don't have enough. We didn't put enough parking. So they wanted to ensure that there would be enough parking at this facility based on what they've had elsewhere. I think Home Depot is another one And part of their parking is used for outdoor storage when they sell in their mulch and, you know, their
Right.
little
But on the
barns.
Henry Ford, it could also be a hedge on expansion down the road. And in Home Depot, it could also be a hedge on outlot development, which I think they're right now pitching.
And you see that with major shopping centers, I'm talking the ones that have the Macy's and the, you know, all the rest where they don't need all that parking.
Right.
And now they're, you know, I don't know, I'm sure they're land splitting off parts of it for other uses.
But the question before us is whether we should
Right size.
overhaul and lower the minimum standard. So are you saying, Keith, I'm trying to follow what you're arguing, that we shouldn't lower the minimums, we should keep the minimums where they're at?
I think using the average data is going to get you in trouble.
But what would you use instead of that? How would you, if I came to you and I had a development and it was up to you to figure out what the appropriate parking would be, what would you do? Because I don't know. I mean, without some standard and some process. So what happens, what's the process for a variance on that? So the minimum says I need to have 50 spots and I come in and I say, there's no way in hell I need 50 spots. It'll never be full. It'll be Kmart.
So the planning commission can grant up to a 25% reduction from the minimum. If someone wanted more than that, they would have to go to the ZBA and state a case of undue hardship.
So the planning commission can grant 25%, then so there is an administrative process. You can go to the ZBA if that minimum is too punitive or too, that's not the right word.
Conservative.
Yeah, and if the planning
Excessive.
commission, refuses to grant the 25%, the applicant can similarly go to the ZBA for up to that 25. But typically, if you guys deny it, they don't move on, you know what I mean?
We're really only talking about new developments or big turnover like Henry Ford.
Right.
I mean, we're not talking about all of a sudden Bush's parking lot, they're gonna tear up half their parking lot and plant rain gardens.
Yes, so we're talking about new development and the reoccupancy
And
of existing buildings. So for a development like Bush's, the building is still dictated by the setbacks and the height restrictions, so you're not gonna see suddenly people selling off parking lots and building new buildings. you know.
Right.
Instead, people could choose to convert parking lots into green space if they so wanted to. I mean, that's an expensive procedure, but really it's for new developments.
So, sorry, Gail.
No, that's okay. So it's not gonna be a massive overall, because the township's pretty developed already.
It sets the tone for the next
Right.
several decades.
Right.
Yes.
So do you know of any examples where a lease arrangement fell through because there was minimum parking that was?
Yeah, so the trading post, there was an agreement for it to become a new dental office, and that one fell through, for example, because they couldn't meet the minimum parking.
There was going to be a dental office in the Trading Post?
A big dental office.
That's a lot of teeth.
Yep. So there's, it's most frequently along Ann Arbor corridor that people are interested in reoccupying buildings, but it also accounts for industrial buildings as well. So for example, 1-800 Pack Rat, which is off, God, I have no idea what road that's off, but it's up in the industrial area. They have so much parking and no use for it, and they're using it to store outdoor storage pods. So
And they have that parking not because the developer said, we need to have more parking than the minimum requirement is, but because the minimum requirement said they had to have that much parking.
yes, and that's most common. The only industrial users that typically ask for more parking are those that have freight. So really, it's the freedom to build as much as you need, but we're not going to require you to build any more than the minimum or the maximum necessary.
That's an interesting question, I think.
So let me ask this question. Let's take Kroger's, which was, excuse me, developed under a consent judgment. And so they expanded. They tore down some buildings and they made it bigger. So they went through that, and let's say the township says, well, thanks for your investment, but you have enough parking already. I mean, that's what would happen, or because it's a consent judgment, it would be handled in a different way?
So I don't know the terms of that consent judgment. Can you refer me to what you're talking about specifically?
Well, all I know is that whole shopping area, where Kroger's is and Ace Hardware and all that, that's all was developed under a consent judgment. I don't know the details of it. Kroger's used to be part of that long strip where Ace Hardware is. And then they bought some apartment buildings. They built the building that we see today. They tore down the old Kroger's that they had. And then there were some adjacent buildings. There used to be a Chinese restaurant, for
Yeah, that
example, and a
wonderful
Big
Chinese
Boy and all of
There's,
that.
I remember Big
Yeah, I
Boy.
miss that Chinese restaurant.
Big Boy.
And, yeah, the Big Boy. And so, and they expanded. So, you know, I'm trying to figure out what implications this has for the future. Or just say it wasn't a consent judgment, just use it as an example. Some,
Yeah.
you know, high volume retailer like Kroger's, like a grocery store would come in and we tell them, well, you got enough parking. You might have, you know, increased your square footage by 25% or whatever, but you've got enough parking.
Yep, that's something that we would tell them. You know, if they have enough, they have enough. If they so choose to build more, they can build it on site or they can build it on any site within 200 feet of the parcel boundary. So if they wanted to buy the vacant parcel next door, not that there is one, but say there was like a vacant parcel next to it, they wanted to buy it and build some employee parking, they'd be free to do so.
So there again is that argument, you know, not being argumentative here, but I'm just trying to think of different scenarios where the township would have lost a development because they had enough parking and they're saying, that's it. The same as saying, well, you require too much parking, so we're going to move away. So we lost as a township in both scenarios.
And if there's a consent judgment, just to clarify, the terms of the consent judgment take precedent.
I understand that,
Yeah.
yeah. But I'm thinking of the industrial buildings too. You know, they often expand.
Yeah.
So the Aunt Millie's Bakery, they expanded. And
Probably one of the most complicated issues that we'll deal with is how do you right-size it?
Yeah.
Or do you right-size it?
right.
And I will say it's a great legacy to leave in the place that you live because parking has a big impact for a long time.
So just going back, just to change this again, are these codes, are they in a certain order or are you just,
These are in order of how they are listed in the current ordinance. So
Oh, I see.
the land use codes in the book are chronological, but in here, I kept the same format so you could compare it. That's like our ordinance has it by category, residential, commercial, industrial, and then alphabetically. So,
so then my comment might be a suggestion for, you know, when you redo the ordinance, if we do go that way. So there's a use here that says banks, businesses, professional offices, architects, that kind of thing. But on the next page, it says drive-through facilities such as banks, establishments with service windows or similar arrangements. So banks is mentioned here because they often have, I think most banks have a drive-through. So which standard do you use?
you would use the drive-through if the bank had those vacuum tube drive-ups, and then you would use these standards if the bank did not.
Say that again, I didn't.
So if the bank has the drive-through where you do the vacuum tubes,
Yeah.
you would use the standards for the drive-through. Whereas if the bank was just, drive in and park, no drive-through window of any type, you would use the standard on the prior page.
I think most banks have some kind of a drive-through now.
Yeah, most of them do. They're just separate.
And then another comment that I have, because it refers to this here as stacking spaces. And I learned last month how the stacking spaces are calculated.
Yeah.
So now, where should those stacking spaces be counted? For example, fast food restaurants often have two windows. One you pay, one you collect your purchase. So which window is used?
That's a great point. The way that IT collects data, they don't count stacking spaces as an occupied space. So we would keep our standards for 5 stacking spaces, 7 stacking spaces, whatever we have today.
Wasn't it from the menu, ordering menu?
No, it's from the window.
From the window?
It was the Taco Bell
Yeah.
place, because
Yeah,
I only
right.
counted 4 or 3,
Yeah.
Right.
where you order. But, and this will happen, especially now when, they have slow on staff, and so it takes a long time for someone to take the order and then somebody's preparing it. So really, you have the backup at the menu board rather than where you pick it up or when you pay. So that's something I think we need to consider is how we count that. And it's mentioned several times here on oil change places and that kind of thing.
So we should reconsider how we count stacking space.
Yeah, how do you count stacking spaces?
Okay, but we're all in favor of keeping stacking spaces as a standard, even though ITE doesn't mention them. Because I think we should keep stacking spaces separate from other parking spaces.
Oh, I don't consider it well, I don't, so IT doesn't count that as a parking space?
Yes, even though a vehicle is occupying a stacking space, IT doesn't count it, but stacking space standards do provide us with making sure that there's adequate turning space, right? So the ITE standards you see, for example, for the drive-through facilities is for the actual parked spaces. So if we are comfortable and have found our current stacking space standards to be satisfying, then I would recommend moving those over. If we have seen a lot of congestion in our stacking spaces, then it might be worth considering, is 5 appropriate? Should it be 7 stacking spaces? Those sorts of things.
I don't know, I'll leave it up to commission.
And we can also discuss this the next time around too, it's okay.
I'm just trying to make things flow through parking and, the rest of it. How it gets accomplished.
It's like you don't want to see somebody build something that has a bunch of surplus parking, but you don't want somebody to build something and people are parking on the street because there's not enough.
Right, and the stacking space, at least an example I provided last month, is it impacts the parking lot because nobody can get in that spot. So
Right.
the fact that, how you counted that stacking space did impact the parking.
It does.
That's not always true in every case, but in that particular case, it does.
So you mean
Kind of
when,
the issue that Chick-fil-A is having in a lot of places. It's just swamped and it's choking other traffic.
And do they do anything for the customer, the curbside pickup? Do they count that differently or?
nope, they do not. They simply go out and observe how many cars are on the site because they have no way to enter the businesses unless they're freely open to the public, for example, industrial businesses. So all they are determining is what's there on the site and what is the given use of the business.
How do you get a job doing that? It sounds like
Yeah, it's pretty crazy. But also remember, you do have to do the late night counts,
That
so
should be okay.
the 2 a.m. out there.
Sounds
You
relaxing.
just visit the coffee
Go
shop,
to the
all
bar.
those late
Yeah.
night.
go to the bar and count the cars. All right.
Okay.
So what's our next steps, or do we have any?
As the commission, you don't necessarily have next steps. I'm just going to completely fill out this table with benchmarks, double check the land use codes and make sure the percentiles are right. And if you want, I can bring you guys in some sample pages from the book to put up next time so we can look at what does a page look like? What does the data actually look like? Because I think parking and also just traffic in general is something that's very mystifying to the public. And the more that we can bring everyone in on the same page to explain how this kind of science gets done, I think that's the better.
Well, thank you for all that work, because that was a lot of work.
Yeah.
Yeah, it is. It took a lot of research to do this and collect it. I do have one more comment, another question. It kind of goes back to the point that I questioned about banks, and the drive-throughs and all that. So going back, there's a use here called golf driving ranges we just spoke about. And then on the next page is a recreation center. So where would the township park come into that? How do you define a recreation center?
Sure.
I guess.
So Township Park, because it is owned by the township, is exempt from all local zoning code, as is all township property. A recreation center would be something like the YMCA or another private recreation facility that is subject to zoning.
Oh, okay.
Are churches exempt from?
No, they are not. So there's only a few things that are exempt from local zoning. One is publicly owned property owned by a township. Two is state-owned property, and that includes state-funded schools. Completely private, only privately funded schools are subject to local zoning, but state-funded schools are not, as well as certain utility and resource extraction sites, as well as small group care homes, whether that's adult foster care or child foster care.
So, and that was another point I had here. I noticed that there was a use here of schools, and we don't have anything to say about schools. So I wonder why that's in here, because we can't do anything about it. But if I understood you right, private schools are subject to, okay, so then, so is a New Morning School considered a private school? Because remember, they were doing some things with that building, and then we were told that we cannot, review their application because they were exempt.
Sure. So when what we mean by private school in this is that they receive no state funding. Charter schools that receive state funding or have state donations in some way are still considered a public school and therefore are exempt. Whereas, say, the Montessori school that you had the special land use review for, that's just south of St. John's, that is completely privately funded. They receive zero state funds.
But New Morning School is private, it's a co-op. My kids went there for
Yeah, I know,
preschool.
it's a different arrangement.
it's
But if
not
they
a-
receive any state support, they're exempted.
maybe they do, I don't know. I wouldn't know.
I doubt if they would get any state support.
Yeah, that was an interesting place.
Either way, that's why we have the standard in here, is for those schools that do not receive any state support.
So the only schools that we, have, I would say, control or, authority over would be like charter schools?
And no, just completely privately funded schools. So if a charter school receives state funding, you do not have
Yeah,
control.
Charter school is considered a public school.
Yeah, they are considered public. But so, okay, I'm getting lost here for a minute. So even though they receive no state funding, the next question is, why weren't we permitted to review the application from New Morning School?
My guess is they receive some form of state funding. I don't know where New Morning School's funds come from, but very often schools have some form of support. It's quite rare that they're completely privately funded. But there is the one, the Montessori school, as the case example.
Four charters.
And that's why schools can have like flashing signs and all the other stuff that we typically prohibit.
I know.
Okay, we beat this one to death.
All right. Well, do you have enough to keep you going?
Yeah, I took down all of your notes about vehicle size, mosques, Scottsdale, let's see what else, shopping centers, shared parking.
Do you have a timeline as to when you want to get this back before us, or are you just doing it when you have opportunities to spend some time on it?
We're doing it in office hours to try to keep the cost as low to the township as possible, because when McKenna works outside of office hours, we bill a higher rate. So my guess is that we would do this in January, especially because in December, you have an anticipated site plan coming before you for a very large industrial building. I think that'll take up probably the bulk of the agenda time. So my estimate is January.
Okay, anything else before we leave this topic?
Well, I just want to reiterate that I think reducing the parking spaces 50% in shopping centers is unrealistic, and we need to find some middle ground that I think a little bit more realistic to usage patterns in a cold weather climate here in Michigan.
I think people will want it. My observation is that they want to make sure their customers have a place to park. They don't want to take a chance they'll just go to somebody else down the street. Okay, and now we're moving on to the October Planning and Zoning report. Any questions or comments on that one?
I'm just curious, the Purcell Place cluster housing option, do we have any sense that that's actually moving forward, or is it?
Yes, they have provided some documents for our attorney to review. We're just waiting for feedback. And also some spelling corrections. A lot of places Purcell was spelled wrong.
Oh.
Yes.
I'm sorry, Nanny, I didn't hear the end.
Purcell.
Oh, I just said, we're also waiting for some spelling corrections. In a lot of cases, Purcell was
sign?
spelled wrong in some of the agreements, so we're waiting for those to come back.
I see.
What about the residential across from the golf course on Beck Road?
Yeah,
Is there a change to that?
Verona
Someone-
Park,
Verona Park by way of changing
Yeah, because he's got a
configuration?
sign up already.
Yes, so Verona Park has submitted a new plot plan to the planning department, and Laura is going to review that next week and determine if it's an acceptable replacement.
Do they have a new sign up,
They're
Dennis?
looking at trying to put ranches in instead.
And they have sent us the plan, we just haven't reviewed it internally yet.
But Dennis, did you say there's a new sign up?
Yeah.
Who's developing?
So there's
It says new
Guy,
plan, something like new,
who's that guy from
words, new
Macomb County
plans
somewhere?
might be available or
Okay.
coming or something. I don't know what the last
coming
word.
soon or whatever?
And I think the starting
doesn't
price is
really know
something
this
like
marker.
600.
He's out in Macomb County or somewhere.
So, yeah, you can see the sign out there.
I thought he was a nice guy, but Kurt said he's difficult to work with.
Anything else from anybody? Any comments?
I wanted to thank Bob for doing such a good job consistently on queuing in the overhead and the computer. It's, especially when you get into Google Earth, that's
good
quite a
mouse.
skill. Thank you.
well stated, I agree.
Did you belong to the AV club?
He's the guy that used to run the projector.
No tape over here on the bridge of your
That's
glasses?
not even what? Projector.
If I hear, there's no further business, we can adjourn at 8:41. Is there such a motion?
Motion to adjourn.
Second.
Moved by Commissioner Postel and supported by Commissioner Boyd to adjourn at 8:41. All in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, motion carries. We're adjourned.